The prairie wind whispered across the parched plains of Hollow Creek, brushing golden dust across the broken fences and rotting wood of what once was a proud ranch. Inside the sagging barn, William Will Granger lay wrapped in an old horse blanket, eyes half-lidded, breath shallow. At 61, the once sturdy cattle rancher had become a shadow of himself, eaten from the inside by a disease that had no name and no cure in these parts. The townsfolk said it was wasting sickness, maybe cancer, maybe something else. No one dared get too close to find out. Will hadn't left the ranch in weeks. No more horses, no more letters, no one came. He'd sold off the last cattle 6 months, back to pay for medicine that didn't work. The rest of his money went to a specialist 2 counties over who never wrote back. The nearest neighbor was 10 miles downriver, and even he hadn't shown his face since Will had started coughing blood. He was dying, and he knew it. The barn was the only place he could still smell the hay and remember a time when this land thrived. He dragged himself out there that morning with a jug of water, a rusted pistol, and a mind full of memories he no longer had the strength to fight off. As he leaned against a stack of feed sacks, eyes closing, he heard the softest crunch of footsteps in the straw. He opened one eye and saw her, a child no bigger than a fawn, barefoot, wrapped in a tattered red sweater to sizes too large. Her dark hair fell in tangled waves, eyes wide and strangely calm. She didn't say a word, just walked right up to him like she belonged there. Will tried to speak, but only wheezed. Then she held something out, a folded note. Will blinked, confused, reaching out with shaking fingers. The girl placed the note in his hand and stepped back, still silent. He squinted at the paper, scrawled in pencil, shaky but legible. Her name is Leela. She can't hear or speak, but she is safe. She knows how to help you. Please trust her. A friend. Will's heart skipped. What kind of game was this? Who was the friend? Why bring a child to a dying man? Why now? Before he could ask, Leela had begun moving around the barn with confidence, as if she'd been there before. She tugged open the old chest near the tack wall, pulling out clean cloths. She brought over a bucket of water and dipped the cloth in, carefully pressing it to Will's forehead. Her hands were small but sure, precise. He wanted to protest, to say you shouldn't be here, but his voice wouldn't come, just a rattling breath and the haunting realization that, for the first time in months, someone had touched him with care. Will's eyes welled up, not from pain, but from something he thought he no longer had. Hope. Will Granger never imagined he'd be nursed back to life by a little girl who couldn't speak a word. The sun had long dipped beneath the hills, leaving the barn swaddled in dusk. The soft bleating of crickets stirred in the fields. Will lay, half-conscious, breathing like an old bellows, while the girl moved quietly around him. More spirit than child. She hadn't made a single sound, not a whisper, not even a gasp, but her presence was louder than the silence that had lived here for months. He turned his head slowly to watch her. She was pouring water from his old rain barrel into a cracked tin cup. Somehow she'd found his stash of clean bandages, what little was left, and laid them neatly beside him, lining them up like soldiers. She worked with a patience that reminded him of his late wife. Nora had once cleaned this very barn with the same steady rhythm. Will coughed a wet, wrenching sound that brought blood to his lips. The girl turned sharply and rushed over. She knelt beside him, not flinching at the sight of the blood. She gently lifted his head and pressed the cool tin cup to his lips. He drank. It tasted like heaven. Will tried to speak, but his throat cracked. He reached a trembling hand toward her sweater. She froze. He tapped his chest. Will, he rasped. My name's Will. She looked at him, eyes full of cautious kindness, then slowly nodded, understanding. He pointed to her. You? She hesitated, then pressed a hand to her chest and tapped twice with her fingers. Will furrowed his brow. Leela, she nodded again. He smiled faintly. Well, Leela, reckon I owe you my life. She didn't smile, but she laid a hand gently on his shoulder. Then she stood and began digging through an old crate in the back of the barn. Will watched her pull out odds and ends, an unopened jar of salve, a box of iodine he'd forgotten he owned, and a faded herbal book Nora used to read. Leela flipped through it with remarkable speed for someone so young. She stopped at a page, ran her finger over it, then turned and brought the book to him. It was a recipe for fever-root tea. She knows what she's doing, Will murmured, blinking. In disbelief, Leela returned to her work. She pulled herbs from a cloth pouch tucked beneath her sweater, sage, dried willow bark, and a few he didn't recognize. He wanted to ask where she got them, but his voice failed him again. She boiled water in a dented tin kettle over a fire she had built outside the barn. The smell of herbs soon wafted inside, earthy and soothing. When she returned, she cradled the warm tea carefully and helped Will drink it in slow sips. It burned his throat, but within minutes, something shifted. The pressure in his lungs eased slightly. His breath deepened. His hands stopped shaking. Will stared at the girl with renewed awe. Who sent you? He whispered. Who told you I was here? Leela only tilted her head, as if trying to read his lips. He repeated it slower, but she looked away, reaching into her sweater pocket. Another note. She handed it to him, her tiny fingers trembling slightly this time. Leela is safe. She finds those who are forgotten. She brings healing in silence. Do not fear her. She chooses you. The handwriting was the same. Will sat back against the hay, stunned. She chooses me. He looked up at Leela again. She was standing beneath the lantern light now, her eyes not childlike, but ancient, like someone who had seen too much, too soon. She signed something with her fingers. He didn't understand it, but somehow he felt the meaning in his bones. You're not alone anymore. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed. When he opened them, Leela had wrapped him in another blanket, tucking it beneath his shoulders like she'd done it 1,000 times. Then she curled up at the foot of the hay bale, resting her head on a saddle blanket, eyes wide open in the dark, watching over him. Will fell asleep that night for the first time in weeks without fear. Morning came with a golden hush for the first time in weeks. Will Granger woke without the crushing weight in his chest. The ache was still there, a constant shadow of the illness, but it no longer screamed. He blinked slowly, surprised, to see the beams of the barn ceiling above him instead of the blurry ceiling of death beside him. Leela sat cross-legged, scribbling into a small weathered notebook with a stubby pencil. She looked up and smiled, not with her lips, but with her eyes. A soft light danced in them, as if she could already see something he couldn't. Will stirred, trying to sit up straighter. His muscles groaned. His joints cracked like old floorboards. But still, he sat. You stayed. He rasped. Leela nodded once and held up the notebook. On the page, in big, blocky letters, it said, "You looked better this morning." He chuckled. Dry and rough. I feel like a kicked mule, but that's something. She flipped the page and wrote again. I'm going to make you walk today. Will frowned. Walk? Little girl, I haven't walked more than a few feet without coughing up something nasty. Leela tapped the page with a small but determined finger, then stood and offered her hand. The silence between them had weight, but it wasn't empty. It was communication, deeper than words. Will looked at her hand. Then took it. Her grip was soft, but firm. With effort, he pulled himself up from the hay bale, groaning with each breath. She steadied him, a child no bigger than a sack of oats. Yet her presence made him feel less like he was about to fall apart. They walked slowly out of the barn, The morning was bright, the sky vast and blue over Hollow Creek. Dandelions had sprung along the fence line, and birds sang songs that Will had forgotten existed. His boots dragged, and his knees wobbled like he'd never used them before. But he walked, one shaky step at a time. Leela didn't rush him. She walked at his pace, her hand always close to his. She led him toward the porch of the ranch house, the one he hadn't dared enter in weeks. "I can't," he said, voice barely above wind. "Too many memories in there." Leela didn't answer, not that she could. Instead, she turned to him, held up her notebook, and wrote with care, "You don't have to go in. Just sit. Let the wind remember to." He stared at her, stunned by the weight of her words. They sat on the porch steps. Will sank into the wood with a wheeze, his legs grateful for the rest. Leela tucked her knees to her chest and turned her face to the sun. It was quiet, but not lonely. "Where do you come from?" Will finally asked. She looked at him, then down at her notebook. She wrote slowly this time, "I don't have a home like yours. I go where I'm needed." "That's not something a child says," he muttered. She looked at him evenly, then signed something with her fingers again, a slow motion across her heart, then toward him. He didn't know what it meant, but it felt like, "I choose you." Something about her reminded him of the wind, free, unbound, unstoppable, yet tender. Like God had given up on miracles, but not on messengers. "Are you an angel?" he whispered, almost joking. Leela smiled faintly, but her eyes glistened. Then she pulled something from her little pouch, a wooden carving, small and roughly shaped like a bird. She handed it to him, closing his fingers over it with both hands. Will looked down at it. "It's beautiful," he said. "You made this." She nodded. And for the first time since his illness, Will cried, quietly. No gasping, no wailing, just tears running down his leathery cheeks as he clutched the tiny bird. "I was ready to leave this world," he whispered. "Now I ain't so sure." Leela leaned her head gently against his shoulder, and for a moment, neither man nor child spoke. They didn't need to. The sky turned dark by mid-afternoon. What began as a gentle morning of sun and wildflowers quickly shifted to something heavier. The wind carried a warning, the kind old ranchers could smell before a single cloud formed. Will Granger knew that smell well. Rain, dust, maybe thunder, and with his body still too weak to move far or fast, a real storm could mean danger. He sat on the porch with Leela, watching as gray clouds swallowed the horizon. "Storms brewin'," he muttered, coughing into his sleeve. "Could get bad out here." Leela looked up at the sky. She didn't seem scared, just alert, as if she knew what was coming before he did. Will clutched the wooden bird she'd given him. Storms don't wait for permission. The girl pointed toward the barn. Will got the message. Back inside, she moved fast, gathering supplies, checking corners, pushing hay bales to brace weak spots in the walls. She'd done this before. He watched from a stool near the door, useless but fascinated. "You some kind of wanderer, huh?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "Going place to place, saving folks like me?" She didn't answer, just pressed a blanket into his hands and motioned for him to sit near the center of the barn. Away from the drafty edges, the wind outside began to howl, and the wooden frame groaned under the pressure. Rain came in sheets. Thunder cracked across the plains like a rifle shot, and the barn lights flickered. Will winced. Somewhere in his bones, the sickness twisted with the cold. He doubled over. Leela was beside him in a second. She pressed a warm cloth to his chest, gently rubbing his back with her small hand. Then, from her pouch, she pulled out a new note. "Storms bring truth." Will looked at it, puzzled. "What's that supposed to mean?" Leela didn't reply. Instead, she lit a lantern and placed it between them, then sat cross-legged and stared at him. Really stared, like she was waiting. Will shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. You want the truth, girl, you've earned it. But I don't know if I got much left to give. She tapped her chest, slowly, then tapped the floor between them. Speak. He sighed, his breath wheezing. All right, you want to know. Here's the truth. He looked past her, out into the shadows of the barn where memories lived like ghosts. I wasn't always alone. Had a wife, Nora, sweetest woman this side of the Rockies. We built this ranch together, built dreams on it. But dreams don't always grow in dry dirt. Times got hard. Money got tight. Then came the sickness. His voice cracked. She stuck around as long as she could, tried to fix me, took care of me until her body gave up. Not from disease, from heartbreak. And when she passed, I just shut down. He clenched his fists, didn't answer letters, didn't go to church, didn't even bury her proper. Just laid her under that cottonwood tree out back, the one she used to read under. I couldn't face the house after that. The thunder rumbled again, louder this time. I think part of me wanted this disease to finish me. Figured it was justice, for quitting, for giving up on her, on life. Leela didn't move. She just listened. For a long time, the barn was filled with nothing but the sound of rain pelting the roof. Then she handed him another note. You didn't quit. You were broken. Broken things can heal. Will stared at it. His eyes blurred. No one said something like that to me in years. She took out one last note. This one folded tighter. She placed it in his lap, then walked to the barn door and opened it slightly to watch the storm. Will unfolded it with shaking fingers. Your wife sent me. His breath caught. He looked up at Leela, her figure silhouetted by lightning flashing beyond the barn. Impossible, unbelievable. But somehow, in the storm's roar and the girl's silence, it felt true. The past, the pain, the punishment he'd given himself, all of it suddenly felt like the lead up to this moment. And the storm raged on. The storm passed like a thief in the night, loud, sudden, and gone without warning. By dawn, the prairie was calm again, the earth wet and glistening under early sunlight. Will Granger sat at the barn door, blanket draped around his shoulders, boots buried in the mud. The air smelled clean washed of dust and ghosts. He looked down at the last note Leela had given him. Your wife sent me. He hadn't spoken since reading it. Couldn't. His voice had left him whether from shock or emotion. He didn't know. But his silence wasn't empty. It was full of something heavy, something sacred. Leela stood beside him now, not speaking, not writing, just being. Will pointed toward the cottonwood tree in the distance. That's where she's buried. He finally whispered, Nora. Leela nodded gently, her gaze softening. The two of them walked slowly, Will leaning heavily on a stick she'd found for him. The grass was damp and glowing. Birds sang as if they knew what was happening. The cottonwood stood tall, branches still dripping from the night's rain. Beneath it, the earth held a grave, no marker, just a simple circle of stones and a bunch of dried wildflowers that had long since faded. Will knelt with effort, wincing as his knees touched the wet grass. I never gave her a headstone, he said, his voice cracking. Told myself I'd get to it. But the truth is I couldn't. I thought if I put one up, it meant she was really gone. Leela lowered herself beside him, pulling something from her satchel, a small object wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a carved wooden plaque, no bigger than a hand. Burned into it, in careful letters, were the words, Nora Granger, loved deeply, missed fiercely. Will's breath caught. He reached for it, cradling it like treasure. Did you make this? Leela nodded once. He traced the letters with his fingertips. I don't know how you knew, but thank you, Lord, thank you. They placed it gently among the stones. The wind shifted slightly, like a sigh. Will sat in silence. The girl beside him, both of them watching the breeze, stir the grass around the grave. Then she reached into her sweater again and pulled out another note. She hears you. You can speak to her now. Will blinked hard. His eyes burned. I don't know what to say. But then, he did. He turned toward the grave, his voice barely more than a whisper. I'm sorry, Nora, for leaving you alone at the end, for not getting out of bed, for letting the light die in this place. The wind rustled the leaves above them. I met a little girl named Leela. She doesn't talk, but somehow she says more than anyone I've met in years. She saved me, just like you used to. He reached down and touched the plaque again. You'd have loved her. She's brave, kind, and strange in a beautiful way. He chuckled softly. Through the tears, you always said God sends what we need, not what we expect. Leela rested her head against his arm. I think, maybe I'm not done living just yet. They sat by the grave until the sun climbed high enough to bathe the whole field in gold. Then Leela stood and took his hand. Together, they walked back to the barn. That afternoon, Will found himself doing something he hadn't done in months, sweeping out the ranch house. He opened windows, aired out blankets, lit a fire in the stove. Leela helped, moving around with quiet determination. She patched holes in the curtains, picked fresh flowers, even arranged Nora's old books on the shelf with care. By evening, the house smelled like life again. Will slumped into his old armchair, tired but satisfied. Your stay in the night inside, he said. No more sleeping on barn floors. Leela smiled not with her mouth, but with her whole being. She nodded and sat on the floor beside the fire, sketching in her notebook by lantern light. Will watched her, marveling. For the first time in what felt like forever, his heart didn't feel heavy. It felt full. He reached over and gently placed the wooden bird she'd carved on the mantel. There, he whispered, a sign this place has been touched by something holy. And outside, under the cottonwood tree, the wind danced through the leaves like a lullaby. The days passed gently, like slow rivers across a quiet prairie. Will Granger, once with one foot in the grave, now walked the land of Hollow Creek with a limp in his leg and a warmth in his heart. The coughing still came, but not as sharp. The fever still flickered, but it no longer ruled him. Something had changed, not just in his body, but in his soul. He wasn't dying anymore. He was living. And the reason sat quietly each evening on the porch swing beside him, her legs dangling, sketching things in her little notebook. Leela, the girl who never spoke, never asked for anything, and yet gave more than he ever thought a child could. She'd brought healing, yes, but more than that, she brought meaning. And Will knew deep down that she wouldn't stay forever. One morning, as the horizon painted itself in orange and gold, Will found Leela by the fence, gazing out across the valley. Her satchel was packed. The wooden bird was gone from the mantel. She had it tied to her bag now. He swallowed. You're leaving, ain't you? Leela turned to him and gave a slow, solemn nod. Will's chest ached not from the sickness, but from something harder. Where will you go? He asked, even though he knew she couldn't answer. Is there another soul like me who's waiting? Dying and alone. She reached into her notebook, wrote carefully, then handed him the page. There's always someone hurting, but not all wounds are seen. He stared at her, the prairie wind tussling her hair. Why me? He whispered. Why'd you come to me? She wrote again. Because you stopped listening to your own heart. Someone had to remind it to speak again. Will's hands trembled as he held the page. And now what? You just walk off into the dust like some angel. She smiled softly. Then she reached up and gently pressed her fingers to his chest. Here. This is where I stay. He let out a laugh that turned into a sob. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, his body weak but his spirit whole. Thank you, little one. Thank you for saving me." She hugged him back, firm, strong, real. Then she stepped back, gave him one final note. "Don't let the silence return. Fill it with kindness, and never close the door again." Will wiped his eyes and nodded. He watched as she walked away barefoot, red sweater swaying, the wooden bird bouncing against her pack. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Will stood on that porch long after she disappeared into the dust and light. 1 year later, Hollow Creek Ranch looked nothing like the place it once was. The barn had a new roof. The garden behind the house bloomed with wild herbs and sunflowers. The porch had been repainted, and a new swing hung from a sturdy beam. Children from the nearby schoolhouse came by to visit the old man who told stories and gave them wooden carvings. A hand-carved sign now hung over the barn entrance, "Lilla's Haven." Inside, Will had built a quiet room filled with books, warmth, and blankets. For anyone who needed rest, a traveler, a lost soul, a stranger. Sometimes people came with nothing but a look of pain in their eyes. Will didn't ask questions. He handed them tea, a blanket, a place to breathe, and on the mantel, next to a framed photo of Nora, rested the little wooden bird, still watching, still reminding him that love had walked into his life in silence and left behind a voice louder than thunder,